Title of our talk today is Why Fear the True God. And we're going to be giving our attention to our circuit overseer, Brother William Osbeck. Brother Osbeck, please.
The word feared doesn't always have to be looked upon as a negative. It can easily be looked upon as a word that's positive. In fact, one person said that the word fear actually is a gift. Now you say, in what sense? Well, if a child runs out into a freeway and you're startled to the point where you run to try to capture and save the life of the child, you would say truly then, fear was a positive thing, because you wanted to salvage the life of that child, and it was for his best interests. I remember when I was young, I was about 11 years of age, and I was caught in a riptide off the coast of Virginia Beach. For just want of knowledge of a riptide, when the ocean strikes against the shore, there's a sucking action oftentimes that takes place, especially if the lay of the land is such that that there's an inclination back to the depth of the ocean. Land doesn't always in its topography lay horizontal. Oftentimes there might be movements of the land at the beach, and then sometimes there's an actual like a ditch or a drain area. And can you imagine, as water hits the beach and then comes sucking back in these unlevel areas of land, waters will come back with greater power and greater strength, greater force. I was caught in one of those drains, or one of those downdrafts. I could feel myself being drawn away from the beach. In fact, I looked at the beach area, but I was helpless. I wasn't a good swimmer. I was only 11. They say that even professional swimmers oftentimes have difficulty in escaping a riptide. Some say just swim horizontally, parallel to the beach. But yet, I wasn't knowledgeable regarding that. I didn't know about swimming parallel to escape the riptide. But then I noticed my father coming toward me. And that really was my salvation. Otherwise, I'm sure I probably would not be here today. My dad could not swim, and my father was only about 5'7". I was already lifted up off the ground in the sense that I couldn't walk on the bottom of the ocean. It was just picking a youngster up and making me buoyant. But my dad, almost in the spirit of that beautiful picture by Michelangelo, remember how in the creation scene, how God stretched out his fingers, remember that? And infused life into Adam? Do you remember the painting? So my father touched my fingers and just broke the spell and brought me back toward him, and thus I was able to escape the riptide. Otherwise, I may have lost my life. So if I ever see a sign that says, beware riptide, would you say that's a positive thing or a negative thing? Would you say it's a gift? Absolutely, it's a gift, because you see, it can save my life. Danger, stay out of the water. Fear, riptide. Now there's another fear today that's even more important for you and I to be very much aware of. There's a force that's more powerful today than a riptide. It's the spirit of this world. It's an animating, energizing force. It's a persistent inclination that seems to control life and sap the very strength and energy out of us as individuals. It can rob us of our spirituality. It can basically cause moral breakdown. It can cause a rise in crime and a rise in violence, and we might even say it causes spiritual hypothermia. Now what would that be? That would be like a freezing up. For example, there are waters way up north in Alaska and the Yukon Territory where if you fall overboard off your boat, you will basically be frozen in 5 minutes and lose all ability to move your arms, and generally you'll sink out of sight. Lake Tahoe also has that propensity. But up in the Yukon, there were two contractors for road work that went fishing one day in a place called Kathleen Lake. It's very much like the Sea of Galilee, because you've got the lake and then you've got mountains surrounding it, and then the downdraft that comes from the wind causes the turbulence of Kathleen Lake, very much like the Sea of Galilee, when Jesus said, "Hush! Remember, be quiet," and he controlled the sea. That lake is identical. And those two men disappeared. Their craft was found, but basically they disappeared. And some of those lakes are so bottomless that in effect you can't find bodies. Bodies will come up maybe 10 years later, possibly, 20 years later, but they were gone. All because of what? Hypothermia. That can happen to us spiritually also. So the question is, if we're not stronger than the world, and we're not really stronger than riptides, then Jehovah lovingly has posted a sign to stay out of the waters of this world. And that's where Christians find themselves. Let's turn our Bible to the book of John, if we may. Let's notice that point about not being part of this world or being part of this system. It's such excellent advice that it's certainly worth our looking at this point. In fact, it's John 17 that we'd like to have you reference. Verse 15 and 16. John 17, verse 15 and 16. It says, I request you not to take them out of the world, but to watch over them because of the wicked one. It says, they are no part of the world, just as I am no part of the world. So if we have a fear of God, then God is saying, have a fear of the world. In the sense that stay away from it. Don't touch it. Because it can completely engulf us or encompass us. And we can become swallowed up. Sometimes when we're young and we're teenagers, we don't feel that could ever happen to us. Because for some reason when we're young or in our early 20s, we feel like we're immortal, incorruptible, fearless, intrepid. Nothing will ever take place. We feel we have the know-how and the savvy. But yet just talk to some who are older, who have put their put their feet into the waters of this system, and it's most difficult. But you say, well, how do I resist the attractions of this world? I mean, there is a spirit of materialism, right? Kind of draws you. We want nice things. You look very nice today. I'm sure your home has nice appointments, and your car probably, you've given it some nice detail. It's clean, and you try to make it look attractive. That's a natural desire, isn't it? But sometimes we could want too much of something that seems to be a good thing. What about men and women? You know, there's a body chemistry that flows between a man and a woman. We've all learned that when you reach a certain age. And therefore, at that age then, we have to become very careful, very conscious of the sensuous attraction that can flow between a man and a woman, especially if they're not your mate, or if they're not perhaps one that you desire to have a relationship with, especially if you're not in a position to do so. How do we view life then? If we turn to Ecclesiastes, the first chapter, it's good to recognize that there are many things that occur in life, many value systems. But probably Ecclesiastes 1:14 is a very good one for us to observe. It says, I saw all the works that were done under the sun, and look, everything was vanity and a striving after the wind. Now that was presented at the district convention last year or the circuit assembly. I had the part, but I can't remember which assembly. They highlighted the point that vanity is like a breath. It's here one moment and then is gone. And basically that's life. It's here one moment. You can treasure that moment in time. But that moment disappears, does it not? And we can't capture it, except maybe in our mind visually or maybe with a camera. But before you jump to conclusions, everything in life is not vanity. Even though it says everything was vanity, there are 4 things in this particular book that Solomon mentions that are not vanity. Hard work, good food, isn't that nice? Good drink, to moderation of course, and then also fear of the true God. And those 4 things are not vanity. But the rest, it's here today, gone tomorrow. So why don't we turn our Bible to Ecclesiastes now, or keep going. We were at the first chapter, just go over to the 12th chapter, if you would. And you youngsters, that's page 883, okay? 883, that's where you'll find it. I won't be giving you probably too many numbers, but just turn to 883, and there you'll find it. Okay, in Ecclesiastes, the 12th chapter, verse 13, it says, the conclusion of the matter, everything having been heard, is fear the true God, and keep His commandments, for this is the whole obligation of man. So if we fear God, what's our responsibility? Remember, the subject of our talk is why fear the true God. So if we fear Him, then we will obey Him. But maybe it's important for us to understand the word fear for one moment. You know, the word fear implies awe. A-W-E. We have the derivative awesome. that comes from the word awe. Also, it means that a profound reverence. So if we have a fear of God, it's an awesome, awe, profound reverence of displeasing the Creator. Would it be proper to say that's an awesome sandwich? You see what you can do with the word awe? You can water it down to the point where it doesn't mean anything to you. And so the word awesome has great meaning. Don't use it in a trite way, if we might suggest. Because sometimes, if you say awesome sandwich or something very similar and constantly everything is awesome, after a period of time we seem to lose that deep-seated appreciation for what the word means. The word is associated with the fear of God. Anything that's supernatural, anything that's spiritual, anything that has to do with the Creator, now, that's awesome. But to say that's an awesome book, and maybe it isn't the Bible, might not really then, in your mind, give you the proper fear that comes from its association with that word. So fear of God means then that we appreciate His goodness, His loving kindness, His greatness, that He's the supreme judge, the almighty one of the universe, and He has the right and the wisdom to basically direct us in our every aspect of life. And that's why you young girls and boys in the congregation, when you think of God and you think of fear, it's a good thing. It's not something that is a negative word. It's nice to fear the Creator, because then you'll always want to please Him. You'll be just like David. Remember the story of David and Goliath? Let's talk about it for a moment, okay? Because this should bring some excitement into you young ones when you speak about David and Goliath. In fact, some of you little guys that have your picture books open there, Bible story books, why don't you turn to that picture of David and Goliath? Because we're going to be talking about that. Oh, not you older ones. Just some of the younger ones who have their Bible story books there with them. But let's turn to 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter. 1 Samuel 17. The David and Goliath. Quite a story. But yet this story helps us to appreciate something. The fear of God versus the fear of man. Now that's a major thrust of this particular talk. The fear of God versus the fear of man. If you stepped out of a train into a concentration camp, as our brothers and sisters did during the German era, along with the Jewish people, if you stepped out of a train, what would you have? Would you have the fear of man, or would you have the fear of God? Because that's going to determine whether you will survive and have a name with God or not. Now, we'd like to say this in the spirit of basically what it's meant. We're living at a time period today when anything unpredictable can happen. We had a 2002 yearbook on the Ukraine. Our brothers and sisters were rounded up in 2 hours. 2 hours, that's all they had. Put all their possessions together. Interestingly, it wasn't just believers. When the Soviets came in 1951, they took everybody in the household, whether the husband or wife was a believer or not, as long as they were associated with Jehovah's Witnesses, they were taken, put on board trains, and for the next 3 weeks they were shipped to Siberia. For what? Because they loved people and they weren't willing to kill them. See, Jesus always taught love. He said, if you have love among yourselves, you're really my disciples. But the world today is practicing and very much involved in the killing scene. Why? Because of one word. One word. In fact, if you'll just leave your finger in 1 Samuel and go to Psalms 91, what drives the world today is a certain ism. In fact, it's called a pestilence. Do you know what it is? Psalms 91, verse 3. There it is. See, verse 1 says, dwelling in the secret place of the Most High is where we want to be. Jehovah's my refuge in verse 2, but notice in verse 3 it says, He will deliver you from the trap of the bird catcher. Now who's the principal bird or catcher that you want to stay away from? That's right, Satan the devil. He's the bird catcher. And from the pestilence causing adversities. Now what's the pestilence? Nationalism. Patriotism. That's the spirit. It's an ism. Satan uses that to divide nations of the earth. And as a result of this ism, to divide the nations, he's conquered the world. Because then he's taught the world to hate each other. And so the world hates. But Christians were always to love. In fact, leaving your finger in 1 Samuel, but turning over to John, the 13th chapter, Christianity has always been known by the motivation behind it, and that is caring for people, loving people. That's why look at all the wonderful colors that we see today in the congregation. You know, if every flower on the earth was yellow, it wouldn't be too appealing, would it? So I like yellow. If every flower was yellow? We love to plant different colors, do we not? Jehovah God loves the different peoples of the earth that make up the one human race. And therefore He wants them living together, as John 13 verse 34 and 35 mentions. I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I've loved you, that you love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love among yourselves. And so, love is the thing that binds people. And if we have a love for God, then we have a fear of God. But if we lose that love of God, and the love for our fellow man, then, for some reason, we become fearful of our fellow man. So let's go to David now and Goliath, and let's develop the story of how if you have a fear of God, you will not have a fear of man. But if you have a fear of man, you won't have a fear of God. Okay? You have the premise upon which we're discussing the point. 1 Samuel, 17th chapter. The champion comes out. Who's the champion? Well, you can see that in verse 4. Champion began to go out from the camps of the Philistines, his name being Goliath, from Gath, his height 6 cubits and a span. Now, children, how tall would that be? That's 9 feet tall. Wouldn't the NBA basketball team love to have another Yao? Now, Yao is about 7'10". Goliath is 9 feet. Wow. David, only about 14, so what height would he be? Any 14-year-olds in the congregation? Okay, you are 14? Wow. You're not going to be my 14 today. Okay. But generally, 14 is maybe about 5 feet. How about 6 inches or such? How tall are you? 6 foot. Wonderful. Okay. You've been drinking a lot of milk. That's great. Okay, good calcium. So anyway, let's say 5 feet 7, 5 feet 6 on the part of our warrior here. And here he's facing off. Now this champion, if you notice, in verse 8, he stood still and began to call to the battle lines of Israel and to say to them, why do you come out to draw up in battle formation? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants belonging to Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. And Goliath said, if he's able to fight with me, and he does strike me down, then we must then become servants to you. But if I myself am a match for him, and I do strike him down, then you must also become servants to us. And the Philistine went on to say, I do taunt the battle lines of Israel this day. Give me a man. Let us fight together. Well, when Saul and all Israel, in verse 11, heard these words of the Philistine, they became terrified and were greatly afraid. There's your fear. Fear of man. So you're stepping out on the platform at Sachsenhausen, or Belsen, or perhaps Auschwitz. It's nighttime, and from all the scenes that I've seen, there are fire pits in the background because that's where they send people immediately that they want to cremate openly. As those fires come up in the background, and as they bounce off the atmosphere, there's an eerie, sinister look to basically each camp. And then the trains rolled in at that particular time as directed by Eichmann and Himmler, who oversaw those camps. And then Jehovah's Witnesses step out. The German SS, in their long uniforms, their coats, and the shepherd dog, growling. What a fearsome scene. You can almost picture yourself there, can you not? We don't know what life is like, but that's what life has been like in various parts of the world. We know right now that even over in areas of the world, it's frightening for people to live in different spots. And certainly whether it's Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, or perhaps Rwanda, or any of these different places, it's been difficult for Christians over the years, just as it was difficult for Christians in early times of Jesus Christ when they were put into the Roman Colosseum. That was difficult. Difficult. But our brothers never faced the lions if you've noticed the pictures. They were simply all together in prayer. They simply didn't look at the lions. When you look at the lions, sometimes you develop a fear, so we don't look at people with a sense of developing a fear. Our brothers, sometimes 100 to 150 strong, came out of those trains and came into camps like Moringen and others. They didn't have a fear of man. If they had, they would have capitulated. They had a fear to displease Jehovah. So notice, with the nation of Israel now, under Saul, they were frightened to death. But what about David? Verse 16. It says, the Philistine kept coming forward at early morning and at evening and taking his position for 40 days. Verse 24 says, as for all the men of Israel, on their seeing the man, notice the man, and it wasn't Christ Jesus, it was the Goliath, the champion, why they went fleeing on account of him and were very much afraid. See how we have to make sure we're not victimized by this word fear? Fear of man? We want the fear of God. The fear to displease him, not the fear of man. You say, how do I overcome it? You pray to Jehovah God. You say, Jehovah, change my spirit. Don't allow me to be frightened by man. Because sometimes it's easy. I'm sure as our brothers got off that train and they saw everything that was happening, that it was so easy for them to become overwhelmed or to be filled with trepidation or fear. But then at that point, you got to challenge it. You have to say, Jehovah, I fear only you. Take away the fear of man. That's how you do it. Psalms 51:10. Want to look at that scripture? Leave your fingers in Samuel. Psalms 51:10. We're kind of building a little case here to help you appreciate how when a crisis comes up, there's a certain game plan, a certain course of action that needs to be taken. Psalms 51:10, and that's the game plan. Notice what we ask. It was in the Watchtower 2 weeks ago. How we exercise self-control. It's the same scripture. We don't have to have 10,000 scriptures in our mind. Sometimes one is good. It says, create in me even a pure heart, O God. Put within me a new spirit, a steadfast one, not the spirit of fear. I only want to fear you. Do you think David did that? I would imagine so, because look now in verse 32. 32, David proceeded to say to Saul, back to 1 Samuel 17. Back to 1 Samuel 17, verse 32. David proceeded to say to Saul, do not let the heart of any man collapse within him. Your servant himself will go and actually fight with the Philistine. How could a 14-year-old boy be that strong? Trust in God. Look at verse 37. It says, then David added, Jehovah, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he it is who will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. At this Saul said to David, go, and may Jehovah himself prove to be with you. David had no fear of man. Why? Because he knew Jehovah. He had already seen Jehovah deliver him from the paw of the bear and the paw of the lion. And that's faith. Now, Tuesday night, we talked about faith, getting into the wheelbarrow. Faith is action. When the Bible says that Noah built the ark because of faith, Noah knew that he was going to be spared by God. By faith, Noah built the ark. He also knew a flood was going to come. You see, faith is the assured expectation. And so it was when Abraham offered his son, Isaac. Abraham had faith. Why? Faith was the awareness of the fact that Jehovah God could easily bring him back. In other words, we know the outcome. That's faith. We know the reality, the expectation. We're assured of it. And we know Jehovah God's going to be with us there on the very platform, no matter what the SS might think. And they could only comment at the end of the war in a book called Hell, H-E-L-L, written about Jehovah's Witnesses. It said the SS were never equal to the challenge that Jehovah's Witnesses offered them because of solidarity and friendship and loyalty to God. And friends, you are that way. That's the kind of person we are. So never allow fear of man, whether it's in school, children, or whether it's on the job. Identify yourself immediately. Let people know who you are. Because you see, once you do that, then you have that fear to displease God, and you're not going to be overreached by situations that might present themselves simply because you have not alerted other people to who you are. It's good to identify. identify. In fact, they even slap the purple triangle on the shoulder to let them know. But you must read a book. In fact, the governing body would appreciate very much. You're looking at a little publication called Facing the Lion by Simone Arnold Leibster. Children, it's about a little 11-year-old that was sent to a home of Nazi socialist upbringing. And there were 850 cases in Germany of our children that were actually taken from their parents and sent to the Nazi socialist homes. And this little girl, actually at 11, was taken away from mother and taken away from father. And her story is Facing the Lion. It will build up your strength and show you that even children can keep their integrity. You know, eventually she survived and she lived to an older age, and she's still living now. But one day, back in New York, she met a man called Max Leibster. Max has a book out called Crucible of Terror. Who is Max Leibster? He was a Jew. He was put into those concentration camps along with Jehovah's Witnesses. And when the SS saw Max Leibster, they took him and said, "You're a Jew. You go into the camp there with Jehovah's Witnesses." And so he was put into the barracks with Jehovah's Witnesses. And for the next 2 years, he began to examine his Messiah in relation to the Messiah of Jehovah's Witnesses. And he found that many Jewish people basically gave up. They electrocuted themselves by running to the wire. That the Messiah that they looked for didn't cause them to show common feeling and affection toward fellow Jews. They wouldn't share their bread with them. They wouldn't help them. They wouldn't assist them. He observed that. This book explains all of this in dramatic tones, and you can read it in one day. It's a marvelous book, Crucible of Terror. But then, as his association was with Jehovah's Witnesses, he saw that as the trains were coming in with new witnesses, the brothers already in the camp then would take their bread, their rations, put it all together, cut it in half. They would eat the half, and the other half was for Jehovah's Witnesses coming in off the trains. And he saw that the Messiah of Jehovah's Witnesses, Jesus Christ, had to be the true Messiah, because the Messiah of the Jews offered no hope whatsoever. He became one of Jehovah's Witnesses. He and his wife now travel in various parts of Europe, but as you read those stories, again, you see it's like Daniel, it's like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. You're dealing with not only older scenes, but you're dealing with modern scenes as you read Mozambique in the yearbook. But you see, friends, if we don't read the yearbook, if we say, well, I don't want to take the time, now you have Moldova in the latest copy of the yearbook that you're going to receive. Read those stories. They build up your faith. They strengthen you to have a fear of God, just as David had a fear of Jehovah, because he saw Jehovah God in action with the lion and with the bear. He had a knowledge of what Jehovah's capable of doing. Now, notice, even Saul at the end of verse 37 says, "Go, may Jehovah himself prove to be with you." Saul must have felt bad, because he was sending this youngster out all by himself. In verse 38 it says, Saul now went clothing David with his garments, and he put a copper helmet upon his head, after which he clothed him with a coat of mail. This must have been the beginning of oversized clothing. You know, a lot of youngsters now have oversized garments, but can you imagine? Saul is 7 feet tall. Putting his garments over a youngster about maybe 5'7" or such, David girded his sword on over his garments and undertook to go. He couldn't. Probably couldn't even walk, because he had not tried them out. Finally, David said to Saul, "I am unable to go in these things, for I have not tried them out." So David removed them off him, and he proceeded to take his staff in his hand, choose for himself the 5 smoothest stones from the torn valley, and to place them in his shepherd's bag that served him as a receptacle. And in his hand, children, was the sling. Remember, the same sling that he used for the bear as well as for the lion. And then he began approaching the Philistine. Now notice, the Philistine began to come nearer and nearer to David. The man carrying on the large shield was ahead of him. And when the Philistine looked in verse 42 and saw David, he began despising him, because he proved to be a boy and ruddy of beautiful appearance. He said, "Am I a dog?" This is the beginning of trash talk. You say, trash talk? Absolutely. Sometimes people trash us, and they speak defyingly of us, and sometimes children in school, you're made the laughing stock. I know, I was there. We all were there. But you see, that's exactly what the point of it is. The language that comes from people, whether they're the SS or whether they're kids in our school or whatever, is simply to humiliate us and to make us ashamed of who we are, to stop us from, in effect, having a relationship with Jehovah God. Yeah. We hear trash talk all along by people who are tattooed from one side to the other. But is that Jehovah's way? That's the spirit of the world. Notice it says, am I a dog, so that you're coming to me with staves? With that the Philistine called down evil upon David by his gods. And the Philistine went on to say to David, just come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the fowls of the heavens and to the beasts of the field. Well, did we get overwhelmed by that kind of talk? Nah. Remember David. You're only 14. Notice what David says now. Now we can speak. We can express ourselves. We don't have to be timid and not say anything. Because in verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you are coming to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, and I am coming to you with the name of Jehovah of armies. In other words, what do we learn? Identify yourself. Let people know who you are as an individual. That the God of the battle lines of Israel, whom you've taunted, I'm his warrior. I'm his soldier. This day Jehovah will surrender you into my hand, and I will certainly strike you down, remove your head off you, and I shall certainly give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the heavens and to the wild beasts of the earth. And people of all the earth will know that there exists a God belonging to Israel. And all this congregation will know that neither with sword nor with spear does Jehovah save, because to Jehovah belongs the battle, and he must give you men into our hand. Now what do we learn so far from the account? We're Bible teachers. You see, we don't need the philosophy of men. We don't need science books of higher learning to basically defend our faith. Friends, you have the Bible. You say, well, I need to go to college to get all the wisdom and the philosophy and the understanding. Why, you have the book. We're Bible teachers. That's what we learned from all this oversized clothing business. Saul wanted to give him something that David did not possess. David possessed a slingshot, and the stones. He possessed the fear of God as well as Jehovah God's being with him. We don't need other things. You say, what about science? Well, what about it? Why don't you turn to Genesis 1? You say, what about evolution? Well, what about it? The very book of Genesis, the first chapter, is your defense. So why don't we discuss Genesis 1? A nice little field experience now for you, okay? Ready for the field? Somebody says, you people don't believe in evolution. You children in school, young people. No, we don't. Why don't you? It's a proven fact. Well, in the eyes of some, but not in the eyes of God. Because what's the expression that appears 7 times in the book of Genesis? 1. That indicates we couldn't come from a monkey. That you can't cross kinds. Okay, there we are. Verse 21. God proceeded to create the great sea monsters and every living soul that moves about, which the waters swarm forth according to their kinds, and every winged flying creature according to its kind. And then in verse 24, God went on to say, let the earth put forth living souls according to their kinds, domestic animal, moving animal, and wild beast of the earth according to its kind. In verse 25, it says it 3 times, according to its kind. So what does it prove? It proves that evolution cannot be correct. You can't cross kinds. No way is it possible to have another form of life come from a particular kind, whether it be bird kind, animal kind, human kind. Just can't be. And if a person says, yes, it can, you tell them you'll be back in 3 weeks and let them cross maybe some kinds, and you want to see what the end result is. And you see, that's the way to prove the point. The fact that you can't cross kinds. There's even a science called biogenesis that simply says kind cannot cross with kind to produce a new kind that can reproduce itself. That science is 100 years old. Even Darwin said before he left the earth, before he died, he made the comment, he said, I figure over the next 100 years they're going to find some sort of missing link. just recently, Smithsonian Institution, and they put out a monthly magazine. It was about 3 months ago. I read the article myself. They were talking about Neanderthal man. You know, he was supposed to be the ape man. You know, the ape man that is dragging with his hands the club, and then on the other hand, he's dragging the woman by her hair. But it was quite interesting, Neanderthal. They have found in the Neander district of Germany, where Neanderthal man was found, they have found many, many Neander skeletons with low foreheads. That doesn't mean much. Look around the room right now. You know, not turned around, but some of you have high foreheads and some have low foreheads. My mother was overwhelmed by this evolutionary concept when we were children. She used to always tell us, she said, high foreheads, the mark of intelligence. That's because Neanderthal had a low forehead. And that's why, because her sons had high foreheads, you see. Oh, and she was so proud of her sons. High foreheads, mark of intelligence. Hogwash. It was strictly Darwin. That's all. Neanderthal man. But you know what they found? What Smithsonian Magazine highlighted? They found that in the Neander district, in the rock strata where Neander man was found, that they lined their bodies up. Actually, lined them up for burial, like this. Apes do that? No. And also they found their tools are very highly developed. Tools of construction. So they come to the appreciation that Neanderthal man was simply a German. That's all. Just a bunch of Germans that died. That's true. And Cro-Magnon man, who's physically superior to you and me, who was the great artist in the caves of France, he was a Frenchman. Apes don't paint. And Peking man, 50 skulls over in China, and they did find whittling wood, yeah, and so forth. But Lowell Thomas Sr. blew that one apart about 50 years ago on the island of Ceylon, which today is called Sri Lanka, where he found the Vedas, V-E-D-A-S. Brain size about, 1,100, 1,200, kind of low forehead and such. And they whittled their wood and such. But he took them into the cities of India and civilized them, and they were men. So what's it prove? Proves that, people want to jump to conclusions, but we have the Bible. We have Genesis, the first chapter, and that can help us to understand, really, that the Bible is the book that we need. We don't need scientific expressions to kind of overwhelm us as people. So, as the account here is established, we find that David eventually struck down Goliath, did he not? And that helps us to appreciate that today, all we have to do is to use our fear of the Creator and our appreciation for His commandments and His guidelines as a means of protecting ourselves. But that means we have to read the Bible daily. See, friends, reading the Bible daily and meditating upon it and applying it is really what you hear almost at every single meeting. Some of us are not doing that. It's not because you're not spiritual. What happens sometimes is you're too organized. What do I mean? Well, for example, we come home today. I'm going to drop my Bible into my briefcase, or I'm going to put it up on the shelf. There's an old saying, out of sight, out of mind. And if the Bible is out of sight, even though I'm a spiritual person, I won't remember to read it, because I don't see it. But if I suddenly have the Bible visible at my nightstand, or on my kitchen table, the propensity for me to read that Scripture will be there. And I will read it, and the more I read it, the more I'm aware of how Jehovah's thinking. And my sensitivity toward the Scripture will be there, and the desire to apply it. And teens, why don't you make the truth your own? Don't let the truth just simply be because of mom and dad. They can only give you a heritage, your mom and dad. But you've got to start reading it yourself. Where did teens start? Read the book of Proverbs. I know when I was single, I think I read the book of Proverbs 5 times, just to give me some intelligence, give me some wisdom, to help me make some right decisions. Because when we're young, we're not as intelligent as we are when we're older. And so that helps us then as an individual. A carpenter was once asked why he never lost his fingers. He said, I never lost the fear of the saw. So then why is it that we as individuals don't lose our spirituality? Well, because we don't lose the fear of God. And the fear of God means reading about God, obeying His commandments, and appreciating who He is as a creator. There's 4 things that we'd like to have you write down if you're taking notes, or at least think about what the fear of God accomplishes. Number 1, it keeps us alive spiritually. Keeps us alive spiritually. And think of David. Number 2, it helps us to overcome the fear of man. Again, think of David. That's 2. So it keeps us alive spiritually, helps us overcome the fear of man. Maybe at this point I could share just a very touching point with you, because it helps you to appreciate listening to the voice of God is so important. There was a 12-year-old that was on the ledge of a New York City building because there was a fire inside. And the firemen came and they pumped up a large pillow and they bellowed to the child to please jump. But the girl would not jump despite constant urgings. She was blind. They found that out. They called her father. And the father stood down below and called out to his daughter, and he said, "I love you." And she recognized his voice immediately. He said, "On 3, I want you to jump." And then he began to count. 1, 2, 3. And she jumped. And she was saved. And what's the point that we learned? We learned that when you recognize the voice of somebody, like the voice of Jehovah, then you see you don't have any fright. You don't have any fear. But if it's other voices that you're hearing all the time, voices from television, voices from music, whatever type of music we hear, if that's the only voice we're listening to, voice of friends at school or workmates, then you see the right message isn't going to be coming, and you may not jump. And it may result perhaps in our everlasting harm, because we won't have made the right decision. The fear of Jehovah, the 3rd point, helps us to avoid bad conduct. And certainly we'd have to say it brings happiness to us as an individual. So those 4 points, the fear of God helps us with. So that means in the field of morality, in the field of neutrality, where we talked about loving people instead of hating people, in the field of child training, which Jehovah's Witnesses are doing so very, very well, in the field of pursuing peace, where we get along with each other. And isn't that remarkable? 6.5 million people getting along together all over the earth because they love God and they appreciate the fact that He's bringing a family of people together, uniting them at this time. And then because we share the truth. Now, some of you feel that I'm sad because I can't do what I used to do. When we get older, we have to become realistic. Remember, if you can't be a lighthouse, you can be a candle. So why not think of yourself as being a candle? If you don't have the broad beam of energy any longer to be a lighthouse. But by all means, as we take these 4 steps, we're truly proving that we have a fear of God. And we live in a world that doesn't have a fear of the Creator. So by all means, let's heed the sign. Let's stay out of the waters of this system of things. Let's remove ourselves from the riptide. And when persecution strikes, which it will, keep preaching and keep standing firm in the fear of God, and He will sustain you and me for now and through eternity.